The murder of Cynthia Gonzalez in September 1991, Arlington, Texas. The heat hasn't broken yet. It won't for weeks. This part of North Texas in the dying days of summer feels like the world is holding its breath. The grass gone yellow-brown, the asphalt still soft in places, the sky at night a deep bruised purple that fades to black around the edges. It is the kind of heat that makes people feel restless. The kind that makes neighborhoods feel smaller than they are, that pushes people out onto porches and front steps where they sit in the dark with cold drinks and low voices. It is the kind of heat that lingers long after the sun goes down, sitting on the city like something unfinished. Something waiting. The date is September 16th, 1991. And somewhere in Arlington tonight, a mother is getting ready to leave her house. Her name is Cynthia Gonzalez. She is 25 years old, and she is beautiful in the way that people who have survived difficult things often are, with a warmth in her eyes that doesn't come from an easy life. She is the kind of woman who remembers your birthday, who shows up, who makes whatever room she's in feel a little less lonely. Her friends will tell you later that Cynthia had a laugh you could hear from the next apartment, full and unself-conscious, the laugh of someone who has decided that joy is not a luxury she can afford to skip. She is young. She is funny. She is a mother. Her daughter's name is Jessica. Jessica is 6 years old and has Cynthia's same dark eyes. Cynthia works as an adult entertainer. Later, the police reports will note this with clinical detachment, as if her profession is a clue about her character. It is not. It is simply how she makes rent, how she keeps the lights on, how she buys Jessica new shoes when the old ones get too small. There is nothing complicated about a woman doing what she has to do to take care of her child. Cynthia Gonzalez is not a statistic. She is not a cautionary tale. She is a 25-year-old woman who loves her daughter and calls her friends back and laughs too loud, and she deserves every word of this story. Earlier that evening, Cynthia does something that will haunt everyone who loves her for 34 years. She drives Jessica to her ex-husband's house and drops her off. This is routine. The handoff is quick, the way those things usually are, a hug at the doorway, a word or two about the week. Jessica goes inside. Cynthia watches for a moment, the way mothers do, making sure her daughter is safely through the door. Then she drives away. She has a work appointment that night. A client. A private dance. This is not unusual. This is Tuesday night and Cynthia has bills and a daughter and a life to maintain. She gets back in her car and she drives into the warm September dark, and nobody who loves her sees her alive again. The hours that follow are ordinary in the way that disasters always seem ordinary in the time before they happen. The city moves. People watch television. Sprinklers run their automatic cycles on lawns nobody is watching. Somewhere in Arlington, a mother is trying to work and come home safely to her child. Somewhere else, something is already in motion. Something that has been building in the heart of someone who knows Cynthia's name, who knows her schedule, who has already decided, for reasons rooted in jealousy so consuming it has curdled into something dangerous, that Cynthia Gonzalez does not deserve to keep living her life. By the time the night ends, Cynthia's car sits abandoned on a quiet street. The engine is off. Her purse is inside. There is no sign of a struggle on the outside of the vehicle, but the absence of Cynthia herself tells investigators something they don't yet have words for. She didn't walk away. She didn't choose to disappear. She was taken. Her ex-husband reports her missing the next morning, September 17th, 1991. He is the one who sounds the alarm, who makes the call, who puts her name into the system. He tells the police about the car, about the appointment, about the client she was going to meet. Officers find the vehicle within hours. It sits there on the street like a question with no answer, a piece of Cynthia's life, interrupted mid-sentence. In the days that follow, Arlington holds a particular kind of dread in its chest. This is a city of working-class neighborhoods and strip malls and churches and school parking lots where parents idle in long lines every afternoon. It is not the kind of city that imagines this kind of thing happening here. But now a young woman is missing, and her abandoned car sits at the center of a story nobody knows how to finish, and the people who love Cynthia Gonzalez are making phone calls that go unanswered and checking in with each other in the anxious language of people who are not yet ready to say out loud what they are starting to fear. The police launch an investigation. They talk to the client she was supposed to meet. They canvass the area around the abandoned car. They pull on every thread they can find. But the threads keep leading somewhere murky, somewhere just out of reach, and the days keep passing, and Cynthia does not come home. On September 22nd, 1991, 5 days after her ex-husband first reported her missing, A body is found on private property in a rural stretch of Johnson County, about 30 miles outside Arlington. The land is flat and dry and quiet. County Road 313 runs through it like a sentence nobody wanted to finish. The body is badly decomposed. It has been shot multiple times. Investigators identify it through fingerprints. It is Cynthia Gonzalez. Jessica is 6 years old, and her mother is never coming home. But somewhere in this city, walking free, going about her days, is the person who put Cynthia in that field. And nobody knows her name yet. The crime scene photographs are already difficult by the time investigators sit down with them in the fluorescent quiet of the homicide division. Outside the precinct windows, the city moves, cars at lights, kids on bikes, the ordinary Tuesday machinery of a place that doesn't yet know what has been found 30 miles south in Johnson County. Inside, detectives spread the files across a table and begin the slow, deliberate work of trying to understand how a 25-year-old mother ended up shot multiple times and left to decompose on a stranger's land. The air in the room is flat and cool, the kind of institutional chill that doesn't feel like comfort. It feels like the opposite. The case is new. The body is identified. The questions are everywhere. The lead detective assigned to the Gonzalez case is not a young man anymore, but he has the particular quality that the best homicide investigators develop over time, a patience that looks like stillness but is actually constant motion underneath. He moves through the world of this case methodically, pulling at threads, knocking on doors, sitting across from people and watching their faces as they talk. He will spend years on this case. He will carry it home with him and wake up with it and return to it again and again during the long quiet between active investigations. He will die in 2013 without ever making an arrest. But in the fall of 1991, standing at the beginning of what he doesn't yet know will be a lifetime's pursuit, he starts with the people closest to Cynthia. He starts, as investigators always do, with the name that keeps coming up. Her name is Janie. She is around Cynthia's age. She knows Cynthia personally. They move in overlapping circles, share mutual connections, have history together in the particular way that people in the same small world of a city's edges accumulate history. The detective notes her name early. She is not the only person he is looking at. But she is a name that keeps surfacing, rising to the top of the paperwork like something buoyant and unavoidable. What the detective begins to piece together in the weeks following Cynthia's murder is a story that is as old as human nature and as ugly as jealousy gets when it is allowed to metastasize unchecked. There is a man. There is always a man, in these stories, not because men are always the primary agents of violence, but because desire and possession and the rage that comes when someone else is chosen instead of you can make people capable of things that would have seemed unimaginable to them 6 months earlier. The man's identity is never publicly released. He exists in the case files as a presence rather than a person, a romantic figure at the center of a triangle that has turned lethal. What investigators learn is this: he had been in a relationship with Janie Perkins. That relationship ended. It ended specifically because he chose Cynthia Gonzalez. He left Janie to be with Cynthia. He told Janie this several weeks before the murder, directly, clearly, with the particular cruelty of honesty that people in love sometimes believe they owe to the people they are leaving. For Janie Perkins, this information does something. It is not possible to know exactly what it does in the interior of another person's mind and heart. Investigators can only measure what comes out on the other side of it. What comes out, in the weeks that follow, is behavior that the detective notes in careful, neutral language that nonetheless tells a story. Perkins has no alibi for the night Cynthia Gonzalez disappeared. When detectives ask her where she was on September 16th, the night a woman she knew walked out of her house and never came back, she cannot tell them. Not in the way that matters. Not in the way that can be verified or corroborated or placed on a map and confirmed. The detective arranges a polygraph. Then a second one. Perkins agrees to both voluntarily, a fact that her attorneys will later point to as evidence of innocence, as if only a guilty person would refuse. But the tests tell their own story. When the examiner asks her directly whether she knows who killed Cynthia Gonzalez, the results are not favorable. When the examiner asks whether she herself is responsible, the results are not favorable again. Polygraphs are not admissible in court. Everyone in the room knows this. But they are telling, not as evidence, but as weather, as atmosphere, as the shape of something the detective can feel but cannot yet hold. The community around Cynthia's death is still in the raw, open phase of grief. People who knew her are gathering in the ways that communities do when someone young is taken, on porches, in parking lots, in the low-lit corners of places where people go when they need to be around other people but don't have words yet. There is anger here, the specific anger of people who feel that the world should be safer than it is, that mothers who drop their daughters off at their ex-husbands' houses and drive to work should be allowed to come home again. That is not a radical expectation. It is the minimum. And Cynthia was denied it. For Jessica, who is 6 years old and cannot yet fully process what the absence of her mother means for the rest of her life, the world has gone strange and quiet in a way that will take her decades to fully understand. She is staying with her father. The adults around her are careful with their words. But children feel the shape of things even when they can't name them, and what Jessica feels is a gap where her mother used to be, enormous, unaccountable, present in every ordinary moment of every ordinary day. Then comes the detail that will sit in the case files for 34 years, waiting to be properly seen. Two men come forward. They are witnesses, people on the edges of this world who have heard something they cannot unhear. Separately, in different conversations at different times, they tell investigators the same thing, that Janie Perkins spoke about the murder. Not in a general way. Not in the way that rumors move through a community after a violent death. In a specific way. In a way that included details that had not been made public, details that were not available to someone who was simply a casual acquaintance of the victim, details that the detective recognizes immediately as the kind of information that only lands in a person's mouth one way. The detective writes it down. He files it carefully. He knows what it means, or what it suggests. But knowing and proving are different countries. And in 1991, in a case without forensic evidence connecting Perkins directly to the crime, knowing is not enough. The witnesses' statements go into the file. The file goes into the cabinet. The case goes cold. But here is the question that will haunt this investigation for 3 decades. If two men told investigators that Janie Perkins admitted to knowing, in specific, impossible to coincidental in no detail, what happened to Cynthia Gonzalez, why was that never enough to charge her? The answer to that question lives somewhere in the gap between what investigators knew and what prosecutors were willing to do with it. And in 1991, in Texas, for a young woman whose profession made her easy to dismiss, that gap was wide enough to lose 34 years in. October in North Texas brings the first real suggestion of relief. The temperatures drop to the 80s, then the 70s, and the air loses that pressed down, suffocating quality that defines the long Texas summer. Leaves don't turn here the way they do further north, but the light changes. It comes in at a lower angle, turns gold in the late afternoon, makes the ordinary streets of working-class Arlington look, briefly, like somewhere beautiful. Children go back to school. Football season fills Friday nights with stadium light and noise. Life continues with the casual cruelty it always shows in the aftermath of a violent death, indifferent, uninterrupted, moving forward whether or not everyone is ready to move with it. In the neighborhood where Cynthia Gonzalez lived, people are still talking. Memory is fresh, the way it only is in the first weeks after something terrible, every detail sharp-edged, every conversation weighted with the particular gravity of people who feel they may be holding important pieces of a puzzle they don't know how to complete. Detective work in a homicide investigation is not glamorous. The lead detective assigned to the Gonzalez case knows this better than most. He is not a television detective. He does not have brilliant flashes of insight that crack cases open like eggs. What he has is patience, a legal pad, and the willingness to sit across from people for as long as it takes and ask questions until something shifts. He has been going back to the same names, the same addresses, the same corners of Cynthia's world over and over again since September, each time hoping that something previously unsaid will surface. This is how cold cases work before they become cold cases. This grinding, repetitive return to the same material, hoping that time or trust or a different angle of questioning will produce something new. What he is building is a portrait, not just of the crime, but of the world Cynthia moved through. Her friends, her clients, her social circle, the overlapping relationships and rivalries and loyalties that structure any human community, but that in this particular community of this particular city in 1991 are especially complex. He is drawing a map, and the map keeps pointing to the same location. The people who knew Cynthia personally are not a monolithic group. Some of them are cautious with investigators, the specific caution of people who have learned through experience to be careful about what they tell police. Others are angry and want to help, want to give the detective everything he needs to put someone away for what was done to their friend. And some, a few, are telling him things that he has to sit with carefully, things that arrive in the middle of conversations like unexpected weight. Two men come to the detective's attention in the days and weeks following the murder, independently of each other, through different channels, in different contexts. They are not connected to each other in any particular way. They do not know each other well. But they share a piece of information that lands on the detective's legal pad with the kind of quiet significance that changes the texture of an investigation without yet changing its direction. Both men, separately, tell investigators the same story, that a woman in Cynthia's social circle, a woman who had reason to be angry about Cynthia's relationship with a mutual romantic partner, had said things about the murder that she should not have been able to say. Not rumor. Not hearsay in the loose, social sense. Specific things. Details. The kind of details that are deliberately withheld from public reporting precisely because they function as a test, a filter that separates the people who know because they were there from the people who know because they read the newspaper. The detective writes down what the two men tell him. He checks their accounts against each other. They align. He checks their accounts against what the investigation has established about the crime scene, the body, the manner of death. They align there too. What these two men are describing, in plain language, in a police interview room in Arlington, Texas, in the fall of 1991, is a confession. An indirect one. A confession made not to investigators but to people in an ordinary social context. The way people sometimes say things they shouldn't because the weight of what they are carrying becomes too much to hold alone, and they need someone else to hold a corner of it, even briefly. The neighborhood where Cynthia lived feels the absence of her in complicated ways. She was liked. She was the kind of neighbor people notice when they are gone, not in a quiet, peripheral way, but in the way of someone whose presence made a block feel more inhabited, more human. Her apartment is still there. Her parking spot is empty. The women she knew check on each other now with a new frequency, a new undercurrent of anxiety in their conversations that wasn't there in August. The question is implicit in everything. If it could happen to Cynthia, who else is it happening to? Who else is moving through this city in the ordinary way and not knowing that something has already decided to end them? Jessica, now 6 years old and absorbed into the protective custody of her father's household, does not fully understand what the adults around her understand. But she understands absence. She understands that her mother's voice is not there in the morning and not there at night and not there in the particular way it was there when Cynthia was alive, specific, irreplaceable, the voice that meant safety and warmth and the certainty that someone was watching out for her. That voice is gone. And in its place is a silence so large that it will shape the rest of her life in ways she cannot yet begin to map. But here is what the detective is sitting with, as October deepens and the North Texas air finally cools and the case begins to settle into the long, uncertain middle distance between active investigation and cold file. He has two witnesses. He has a woman with no alibi. He has failed polygraph tests. He has statements indicating the woman was glad Cynthia was dead, had thought about arranging it. He has, in other words, almost everything except the thing that prosecutors in 1991 tell him they need to move forward, a direct forensic connection between the suspect and the crime. No physical evidence ties her to the scene. No fingerprints. No fiber. No DNA, not in the modern sense. The technology that will eventually make cases like this prosecutable is still being developed in laboratories, still being argued over in courtrooms, still years away from being the tool that investigators in 2025 will treat as routine. In 1991, in Texas, you need more than what the detective has. And so the woman who told two separate people that she knew what happened to Cynthia Gonzalez in specific, undeniable detail continues to walk free. The file grows thicker. The detective keeps working. Somewhere across the city, a 6-year-old girl is growing up without her mother. And nobody has been charged with anything. But here is what nobody knows yet, what will only become visible 34 years later, when a group of students sits down with these same files in a fluorescent classroom at a university campus 12 minutes from where Cynthia lived. The answer was always here. It was in the file. It was written down. It was preserved. What it needed was someone willing to ask the right question. The years do not move quickly in a cold case. They accumulate. Each year that passes without an arrest is another layer of sediment on the Gonzalez file, another year of active cases crowding in front of it, another year of detectives being reassigned, retiring, dying. Arlington, Texas, grows in these years. The city fills outward with new suburbs, new strip malls, new schools, new people who have no idea that a 25-year-old mother was shot multiple times and left in a ditch in Johnson County while her 6-year-old daughter waited for her to come home. The city doesn't carry its unsolved murders in the way that traumatized communities sometimes do. It carries them quietly, in the file cabinets of the homicide division, in the private grief of the people who knew the victims, in the restless sleep of the detectives who couldn't close the cases when the cases were still warm. The lead detective on the Gonzalez case does not stop working it. This is important to understand, not as a romantic gesture, but as a practical fact about the kind of detective he is. Between active cases, when the urgent, pressing noise of new homicides allows it, he returns to Cynthia's file. He pulls it out and goes through it again, looking for the thread he hasn't found yet. He rereads the witness statements. He rereads the interview with Perkins. He rereads the accounts of the two men who came forward in 1991 and told investigators about the specific details she allegedly shared. He is looking for the angle he hasn't tried, the question he hasn't asked, the connection he hasn't made. He doesn't find it. This is not a failure of character or intelligence. It is a structural problem. The problem of a department that has no dedicated cold case unit, that relies on active homicide detectives to maintain cold cases in the margins of their regular workload, that cannot offer any single investigator the sustained, full attention focus that a case like this requires. The detective is good at his job. He is also working multiple active cases simultaneously, always. The math of his attention is simply not on Cynthia's side. He retires eventually. And then, in 2013, he dies. He never makes an arrest. This is a fact that the people who knew and loved Cynthia Gonzalez will carry forever. The knowledge that the man who worked her case the hardest and the longest left this world without seeing it closed. For Jessica Roberts, who is no longer 6 years old, who has grown up, built a life, become a woman in her 30s and 40s while her mother's case sat untouched in a filing cabinet. The years have their own particular texture of grief. She has said publicly that the grief never fully subsided, that it came in waves, not just for her, but for other family members, for friends of Cynthia's who have grown older and moved on in the external way that life requires while carrying the internal, unresolved weight of an unsolved murder. The grief of an unsolved case is different from the grief of a solved one. In a solved case, there is something to attach the pain to, a name, a face, a verdict, a sentence. In an unsolved case, the grief floats. It attaches to everything and nothing. It is ambient, pervasive, the background radiation of a life built around a hole that never got properly closed. Jessica knows the name Janie Perkins. She has known it for years, the way families in unsolved murder cases always come to know the names that swirl around the investigation, the names that investigators mention carefully and in qualified language, the names that become, over time, private theories, private suspicions, private sources of the particular anger that has no legitimate outlet because no charge has ever been filed. But knowing a name and having a name mean something legally are different things entirely. And for decades, knowing the name Janie Perkins does Jessica Roberts no practical good at all. The community around the Gonzalez case has thinned over the years. The friends who knew Cynthia in 1991 have scattered. Some have died. Some have moved. The neighborhood where she lived has changed, the way all neighborhoods change over 30 years. New families, new faces. The physical evidence of Cynthia's life there slowly overwritten by the accumulation of other people's ordinary days. The city of Arlington has grown into one of the largest cities in the United States. It has a Major League Baseball stadium now, an NFL franchise, a university campus with 50,000 students. The working-class neighborhood where a 25-year-old woman dropped her daughter off and drove to work and never came home has been absorbed into the larger geography of a city that barely remembers what it looked like in 1991. But grief, unlike neighborhoods, does not renovate. For the people who loved Cynthia Gonzalez, the year remains 1991 in the particular way that loss always keeps one foot in the moment it happened. Every September, the anniversary arrives. Every year without an arrest is another September that means something different and worse than the last. In 2024, something shifts. Not dramatically. Not the way it will shift in 2025 when everything breaks open. But in 2024, the Arlington Police Department does something that matters. In the quiet, administrative way that institutional decisions sometimes make history, the department assigns the Gonzalez case to a current homicide detective for review. His name is Detective Stafford. He is not the original detective. He is younger, trained in a different era, operating with different tools and different standards of evidence, and a different understanding of what can be built from witness testimony and behavioral evidence in the absence of direct forensic proof. Detective Stafford opens the file. He reads about the two witnesses. He reads about the failed polygraphs. He reads the statements indicating that a woman named Janie Perkins told investigators she was glad Cynthia Gonzalez was dead and had considered having someone kill her. He reads the accounts of what she allegedly told two separate people. Specific details that no uninvolved person should have possessed. He sits with the file for a long time, and then he has an idea. It is not his idea alone. It is the idea of a department willing to try something that most police departments in America have not yet tried. He picks up the phone, and he calls the University of Texas at Arlington. What happens next changes everything. But the question that Detective Stafford is sitting with as he makes that call, the question that has been sitting in this file for 34 years, is this. How does a woman walk free for 3 decades after telling two separate people that she knows who killed Cynthia Gonzalez? And who, finally, is going to be brave enough to answer it? The campus is busy with the particular energy of a new semester. Students moving in, orientation events filling the quads, the smell of fresh syllabi and coffee, and the specific anxiety of people beginning something new. UTA is a large public university in the middle of one of the most populated urban corridors in America. A place where first-generation college students and commuters and working adults share classrooms and parking lots and the general democratic infrastructure of public higher education. It is not the kind of place that features in crime documentaries. It is not a prestigious criminology program with television connections or famous faculty. It is a state school in North Texas doing the quiet, necessary work of training the next generation of people who will enter the criminal justice system as detectives, prosecutors, social workers, advocates. At the start of the fall semester, one class is different from any that has been offered here before. The professor who runs the new advanced criminology course has worked to establish the partnership between UTA's Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice and the Arlington Police Department. The agreement is straightforward and unprecedented simultaneously. Students will be given access to real cold case files, actual unsolved murder investigations from the Arlington PD. They will review the materials, including witness statements, evidence documentation, crime scene photographs, and detective reports. They will not have access to physical evidence. They will work as a class, in teams, under close supervision. And they will report their findings directly to the homicide detectives assigned to each case. This is not a simulation. The files are not sanitized. The photographs are real. The dead people in those photographs were real people with real families who are still alive and still waiting. When the professor explains this to the class at the beginning of the semester, there is a pause in the room. The particular pause of young people being handed something heavier than they were expecting. A group of senior students is assigned the Gonzalez case. Among them is a young woman named J.C. Concanon. There is also Jenna Lewis. They are seniors, 21, 22 years old, which means they were not yet born when Cynthia Gonzalez drove away from her ex-husband's house on a September night in 1991. They have no stake in the prior investigation. They have no relationship to the original detective's conclusions. They have no reason to protect any prior assumptions. They bring to the file exactly what it has needed for 34 years. They bring nothing with them except fresh eyes and the specific energy of people who want, badly, to get it right. The files number in the hundreds. Somewhere between 400 and 500 individual documents, witness statements, interview transcripts, evidence logs, photograph records, coroner's reports, follow-up notes, dead ends documented and filed away. The students begin reading. They read slowly, carefully, the way the professor has trained them, not looking for one big answer, but building a map. Who knew Cynthia? Who was interviewed? Who said what? Who wasn't interviewed? What questions weren't asked? What connections weren't fully pursued? This last category is where the students begin to find things. It is not that the original investigators missed Janie Perkins. They did not miss her. Her name appears in the files. Her interviews are documented. The failed polygraphs are noted. The alibi problem is recorded. The statements she made about being glad Cynthia was dead are there, in black and white, on pages that have been sitting in a filing cabinet for over 3 decades. The original detective knew about all of it. He wrote it down. He was not asleep at the wheel. What the students notice, with the particular clarity of people who have no emotional investment in any prior decision, is the gap between what the files contain and what was done with what the files contain. They notice that Perkins and Gonzalez were friends. They notice the shared romantic partner, the breakup, the timeline. They notice that the motive is not obscure or complicated. It is clear, documented, and supported by the behavioral evidence. And they notice something else. The file references two men who told investigators that Perkins admitted specific knowledge of the murder. The students read those statements. And then they begin asking questions. They ask Detective Stafford whether the two witnesses were ever re-interviewed, whether the sworn statements were ever fully assessed against the evidence, whether anyone looked at what those statements would support under modern prosecutorial standards rather than the standards of 1991, whether DNA or fingerprint comparisons were ever made, whether anything was ever done with the sum total of what the file actually contains. The students are emotional about this case. Jenna Lewis will say later that a fire was lit in her when she started learning about Cynthia, about the mother, the daughter, the laugh, the life. She will say that she and her classmates wanted to solve it not as an academic exercise but for Cynthia's family. For Jessica. For the 6-year-old who grew up into a woman still waiting for her mother's story to have an ending. When the class meets with Detective Stafford to go over their findings, the energy in the room is not the detached energy of students completing an assignment. It is the energy of people who care about what they are doing in the way that makes good detective work possible, a combination of systematic rigor and genuine human investment. Detective Stafford listens. He takes notes. He goes back to the files with the questions the students have raised and he looks at them again with the fresh eyes quality the students have given him, the permission to see the material as if for the first time, without the accumulated assumptions of 34 years of prior investigation. And here is what he finds. When he goes back to the original witness statements, the accounts of the two men who said in 1991 that Janie Perkins spoke about the murder in specific terms, he realizes that these statements are not just notes in a file. They are sworn statements. They are formal, legal documents. And when he places them against the established facts of the case, the evidence, the timeline, the crime scene details that were never made public, they align with a precision that is not coincidental. What Perkins allegedly told two separate people, in two separate conversations, in the early 1990s, matches what only someone involved in the murder of Cynthia Gonzalez could know. Detective Stafford sits with this for a long time. Then he begins writing an arrest warrant. But there is a question he is still not ready to answer publicly. A question that the students, for all their careful work, have not fully resolved. The question is not whether Janie Perkins knew what happened to Cynthia Gonzalez. The question is whether she acted alone, or whether someone else, still unnamed and uncharged, stood beside her in that field in Johnson County on the night a young mother's life was ended. It is just after 6 in the morning and the sky over North Texas is still dark, that particular pre-dawn darkness that isn't quite night anymore but hasn't committed to being day. The temperature has finally dropped into the 50s. The streets of Arlington are quiet in the way that weekday mornings are quiet before the city opens up its engines. The occasional delivery truck, the hiss of a bus, the lights of a gas station on an otherwise dark corner. In a classroom at the University of Texas at Arlington, the desks sit empty in the dark. The files are still on the tables where the students left them. Somewhere in those files, the name Janie Perkins appears 100 times in faded 1990s typeface. 30 miles away, in a small city called Azle, Texas, a convoy of vehicles is assembling. Detective Stafford has been awake since before 5. He is not the kind of detective who sleeps easily on the morning of an arrest, not because he doubts the work, but because he knows what is at stake. 34 years of waiting, distilled into a warrant and a morning and a moment that cannot be undone once it begins. He is thinking about Cynthia Gonzalez. He is thinking about a 6-year-old girl who is now a woman in her 40s. He is thinking about the lead detective who worked this case for years and died without seeing it closed. He is thinking about all of it simultaneously, the way investigators do when a case has become personal, not unprofessionally personal, but humanly personal, in the way that 34 years of a case sitting unresolved eventually makes it. The arrest warrant has been written and signed. 1 count of capital murder. The warrant names Janie Perkins, now 63 years old, currently residing in Azle, Texas. The document is the product of a process that began when a group of college students sat down with a 450-page case file and started asking questions that had not been asked since the original investigation. It is the product of Detective Stafford's willingness to look at the file again with genuinely fresh eyes. It is the product of the two witnesses who came forward in 1991 and told the truth, whose sworn statements sat in a cabinet for 3 decades waiting to be properly seen. The U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force is moving into position outside Perkins' house in Azle. This is standard procedure for a capital murder arrest. You don't send local officers alone. The marshals are trained for this, equipped for this, have done this hundreds of times. The house is a regular house on a regular street in a small Texas city about 4 to 5 minutes west of Arlington. In 2 hours the street will be fully awake, neighbors pulling out of driveways, school buses making their rounds. Right now, in the still dark of an early November morning, it is just the marshals and the waiting. Detective Stafford calls his team. They go over the plan one more time. There is nothing improvised here, nothing left to chance. This arrest has been prepared with the same methodical patience that has characterized the entire reinvestigation. No shortcuts, no assumptions, everything documented and defensible because the defense attorneys are going to be thorough and the prosecution needs to be more thorough still. 34 years is a long time for a case to wait. The last thing anyone wants is a procedural error that gives this moment a reason to unravel. At 6:47 in the morning, the marshals knock on the door of a house in Azle, Texas. Janie Perkins is 63 years old. She has been living in Azle, a small city of about 12,000 people, west of Fort Worth, known mostly for its proximity to Eagle Mountain Lake and the kind of quiet that people move to when they want to be left alone. Whether she has spent the last 34 years thinking about Cynthia Gonzalez is not something the warrant can tell you. Whether she has slept easily, dreamed peacefully, lived the ordinary life of a person with nothing pressing on her conscience, that is not something investigators can measure. What they can measure is the moment the door opens and the marshals identify themselves and say the words that end the 34-year run. She is taken into custody without incident. 1 count of capital murder. She is transported, processed, charged. By mid-morning, the paperwork is complete. At the University of Texas at Arlington, Detective Stafford makes a phone call to the criminology department. He asks the professor to gather the class. There is something he wants to tell them in person. The students who worked the Gonzalez case assemble in their classroom. They are not expecting this. The semester is still ongoing, the case still nominally in progress from their perspective. Stafford walks in. He looks at the faces of these students, 21 and 22-year-olds who were not alive when Cynthia was murdered, who chose to spend a semester with her case out of something that might be best described as moral commitment, and he tells them, the arrest warrant has been issued. The marshals are outside her house right now. The room erupts. There are tears. There is applause. J.C. Concannon, who combed through hundreds of files over the course of the semester, is crying. Jenna Lewis, who said a fire was lit in her when she first started learning about Cynthia, is crying too. They are young people who did something that a lot of older, more experienced people in the same building had not been able to do, and they are not celebrating their own achievement so much as they are releasing the emotional weight of a semester spent sitting with a murdered woman's story and wanting desperately to give it a different ending. Jessica Roberts does not find out until several days after the arrest. She has known something was happening, investigators had been in contact, there had been a vague sense of movement around the case. But the specific news, delivered by phone, lands on her with a force she describes publicly as overwhelming. Shock, relief, excitement, disbelief, a mixture of everything, arriving simultaneously, the way news this large tends to arrive. She says, I thought the day would never come. She has been waiting since she was 6 years old. She is now in her 40s. But here is what the community doesn't yet know. What Jessica doesn't yet know on the day the arrest is announced, and what the UTA students don't know when they are celebrating in their classroom, and what the reporters covering the press conference don't know as they transcribe Police Chief Uljone's statement. Janie Perkins is charged alone. 1 count of capital murder. 1 name on the warrant. But the case files, the same files the students spent a semester reading, contain details suggesting that the logistics of what happened to Cynthia Gonzalez on the night of September 16, 1991, may not have been a solo operation. The man who left Janie Perkins to be with Cynthia. The man whose identity has never been publicly released. The man whose decision, to end one relationship and begin another, set off the chain of events that ended with a 25-year-old mother shot multiple times and left in a field in Johnson County. Where is he? What does he know? And is one arrest really the whole story? The morning of the press conference is clear and cold, the sky over Arlington that pale November blue that feels almost apologetic after the long harsh summer, as if the city is trying to make amends. The parking lot outside Arlington Police Headquarters is full by 9. News vans from every major network affiliate in the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area have claimed their positions. Camera operators check their equipment. Reporters review their notes. There is an energy here that is not exactly celebratory. The subject is a murder, a 34-year-old unsolved murder of a young mother, but there is something beneath the professional composure of everyone assembled that resembles relief. The kind of relief that only comes when something that has been wrong for a very long time is finally, partially, addressed. Inside the building, Police Chief Al Jones is preparing his remarks. Al Jones has been the chief of the Arlington Police Department long enough to understand what this moment means, not just institutionally, but humanly. He is not a man who uses the word landmark carelessly. But when he walks to the podium and looks out at the assembled press and the family members seated in the front row and the group of college students who are also present, slightly overwhelmed by the cameras and the moment, he understands that what he is about to describe is genuinely unusual. A cold case from 1991, solved in 2025, with the help of criminology students from the local university. The first arrest produced by a program that had only just launched. He has been in law enforcement long enough to know that lightning does not usually strike like this. And when it does, you say so plainly. He steps to the microphone. He begins by acknowledging Cynthia Gonzalez. Her name. Her age. The mother she was. He speaks about her not as a statistic or a case number but as a person, as the 25-year-old woman who drove to work one night in September 1991 and never came home to her daughter. He speaks about the 34 years that have passed. He does not minimize them. He does not pretend that the long gap is simply a procedural matter. He acknowledges, plainly, that a family waited too long for this moment. That the criminal justice system did not serve Cynthia Gonzalez quickly. That quick is not always possible, but that 34 years is not acceptable as a standard, even when it is the reality. Then he talks about what changed. The partnership with UTA's criminology department, Jones explains, was born from a specific institutional problem. Arlington PD does not have dedicated cold case detectives. The department is not unique in this. Most mid-size American police departments do not have full-time cold case units. What they have is active homicide detectives who work cold cases between current investigations. This is not sufficient. It is what the budget allows. The result is that cold cases move slowly, if at all, dependent on the availability of investigators whose primary attention is always on the cases that have just arrived, the cases with living witnesses and fresh evidence and families in acute crisis who need answers now rather than eventually. The UTA partnership was designed to address this gap. Give real cold case files to students in a supervised academic setting. Let their fresh eyes and genuine engagement do what overloaded investigators cannot. Sustained, focused attention on the accumulated materials of a case that has already been through its initial investigation and now needs someone to read it differently. Jones tells the assembled press what the students found. He tells them about the renewed focus on Janie Perkins. He tells them about the witness statements that Detective Stafford went back to re-examine after the students began asking questions. He tells them about the sworn accounts of two men who said in the early 1990s that Perkins had shared details about the murder that she should not have been able to share, details that could only have come from direct involvement. He names Janie Perkins publicly for the first time. 63 years old. Arrested November 6th in Azle, Texas. One count of capital murder. He displays her booking photograph. She is 63, with the ordinary face of a person you would not look at twice in a grocery store, in a parking lot, on any unremarkable Tuesday. She does not look like a killer. But then, Jones has been in this job long enough to know that killers never look like what people expect killers to look like. They look like neighbors. They look like co-workers. They look like people who go to the gas station and walk their dogs and live in houses in small cities outside Fort Worth and carry, for 34 years, the weight of what they have done. The students are present at the back of the room. They are visibly overwhelmed. J.C. Concannon, who combed through 400 to 500 files during the semester, stands with her classmates and tries to maintain composure as the chief talks about their work. She will say later that they had to go through crime scene photographs, not just documents, but photographs. The reality of what was done to Cynthia Gonzalez, preserved in forensic detail, reviewed by a 21-year-old student in a university classroom in 2025. That is not an abstract academic exercise. That is an encounter with a real murder. The students absorbed that material and kept working anyway. That is worth naming. The community reaction to the press conference is immediate and layered. On social media, the response is enormous. The combination of a cold case solved, a Texas murder from the 1990s, and college students playing a central role in the arrest creates a story with built-in momentum. But in the neighborhoods around Arlington's east side, in the specific community of people who knew Cynthia personally, the reaction is more quiet and more complicated. There is relief, yes. There is the particular release that comes when a name is finally attached to a charge in a case you have been carrying personally for decades. But there is also grief, the grief of 34 years that can't be recovered, the grief of a daughter who grew up without her mother, the grief of a friendship abruptly and violently ended. Jessica Roberts stands at the front of the room and speaks. She is composed in the way of people who have prepared carefully for a moment they were never entirely sure would come. She thanks the students by name. She thanks Detective Stafford. She says she is so grateful and so proud and so overwhelmed, in almost the same breath, as if joy and grief and relief and disbelief are all arriving simultaneously, and she is doing her best to hold all of it without dropping any of it. She says, "I thought the day would never come." The room is quiet. But here is what nobody in that room has said yet. What the chief has not said. What the detective has not said. What is sitting, still, in the case file, still unresolved, still a loose thread in a case that has just, finally, incompletely, been partially closed. Janie Perkins has been charged. Janie Perkins is in custody. But Janie Perkins, according to the investigation, did not necessarily act alone. The man who left her for Cynthia, whose decision, whose relationship, whose choices form the structural center of the entire motive, has never been publicly identified, has never been charged, has never, as far as the public record shows, been held accountable in any way. Someone drove Cynthia Gonzalez 30 miles from Arlington to a rural field in Johnson County. Someone pulled a trigger. Was it one person? Was it two? The press conference ends. The cameras are packed. The reporters file their stories. And somewhere in North Texas, a man whose identity the police have never released lives out his Tuesday, and nobody from the assembled press thinks to ask where he is. There are houses that hold grief differently than others. Not in their architecture, they look ordinary from the outside, the same as the houses on either side of them on the same street in the same suburb. But inside, certain houses have absorbed years of a particular kind of sorrow. The kind that doesn't announce itself but is present in everything. In the way a certain room in the house is never fully comfortable, in the way certain dates on the calendar land differently, in the way a family photograph on the wall contains one face that is never mentioned without cost. Jessica Roberts has lived inside that kind of grief since she was 6 years old. She is 40 now. She has built a life, a real life, a life with relationships and work and the ordinary continuity that human beings manage to construct even around the most catastrophic losses. But she has never stopped knowing, in the specific way that daughters know things about their mothers, that there is a hole in her story that was put there by someone else. Deliberately. Violently. And for 34 years, without consequence. What is it like to grow up the daughter of an unsolved murder victim? There is no single answer. Jessica has said publicly that the grief came in waves, not just for her, but for the extended community of people who loved Cynthia. Each year brought another September. Another anniversary of the disappearance. Another anniversary of the body being found in that field in Johnson County. The anniversaries don't get smaller. They get more complicated. They accumulate, meaning the way that unresolved things always do. Jessica grew up knowing Cynthia's name was in a file at the Arlington Police Department. She grew up knowing that investigators had not given up, that periodically, the case was re-examined, that detectives returned to it when they could. She grew up knowing the name Janie Perkins the way families in unsolved murder cases know the names that hover at the edges of the investigation, not as a convicted person, not as someone charged with anything, but as a name that carries weight. A name that means something to the family even when it means nothing legally. She did not know, until a few weeks before the press conference, that her mother's case had been given to the UTA students. She found out in stages, first that the program existed, then that her mother's case was among those being reviewed, and then, days later, with the phone call that she did not fully believe was real until the detective said the words plainly, "An arrest has been made." "I thought the day would never come," she said. She has said it more than once. It is a sentence that contains 34 years. At the press conference, Jessica stands with the composure of someone who has spent decades preparing for a public moment they were never entirely certain would arrive. She thanks the students. She thanks the detective. She says she is so proud and so grateful. She is not performing these emotions. They are clearly genuine, arriving in real time, slightly ahead of her ability to fully articulate them. The shock has not fully resolved. She found out on a Thursday. The press conference is the following Monday. That is not a lot of time to integrate the information that the person who killed your mother, who has been walking free your entire adult life, is now in custody facing capital murder charges. What reporters at the press conference do not push her on, and what has not been fully addressed in the media coverage of the arrest, is the question that sits underneath all of this for Jessica. The question of the man. The unnamed man whose decision to end his relationship with Perkins and begin one with Cynthia Gonzalez set off the chain of events that ended Cynthia's life. The man whose identity the police have never publicly released. The man who is, in some structural sense, at the center of the entire story, the axis around which the jealousy and the violence organized itself. Does Jessica know who he is? The public record doesn't say. Has he been in contact with investigators? Has he been interviewed in the current reinvestigation? These are questions that the press conference does not answer. These are questions that the media coverage of the arrest largely does not pursue. The community response to the arrest has its own geography. In certain circles, in certain conversations, there is celebration, unambiguous, deserved celebration of a family finally getting something that looks like justice after 3.5 decades. The UTA students have become briefly famous for the right reasons, held up as a model of what civic engagement and academic rigor can produce when they are pointed at something real. Police Chief Jones' decision to launch the partnership has been praised. Detective Stafford's willingness to look at the case again with fresh eyes has been praised. Arlington PD, which does not often receive unambiguous good press, has a moment of genuine institutional pride. But in other circles, in the quieter conversations of people who knew Cynthia personally, who are old enough now to hold complexity, there is also a recognition that one arrest is not the complete resolution of what happened on September 16, 1991. Janie Perkins is charged. But the full story of that night, who drove, who planned, who pulled the trigger, who was present, how the specific logistics of a kidnapping and murder were organized and executed, has not been publicly told. The case against Perkins is built on circumstantial evidence. The motive, the failed polygraphs, the absence of an alibi, and most importantly, the sworn statements of 2 witnesses who say she told them things only an involved person would know. Circumstantial evidence, in Texas, can support a capital murder conviction. But Perkins' attorneys have made clear they intend to fight the charge. They say she is innocent. They say the facts will clear her. The case is in its early stages. The forensic testing that investigators have indicated is underway. DNA analysis, additional laboratory work, has not yet produced publicly reported results. For Jessica Roberts, the arrest is a beginning. Not an ending, a beginning. The beginning of a legal process that may take years, that will require her to sit in a courtroom and hear the details of her mother's murder argued in formal legal language, that will require her to be present in public for something she has only ever had to carry privately. It is not comfortable. It is not relief in the simple sense. But it is the first time in 34 years that the law has acknowledged, formally and with authority, that what happened to her mother was a crime for which someone must answer. She was 6 years old when she last saw Cynthia. She is 40 years old when she hears the name of the woman charged with killing her. And here is the question that Jessica Roberts has not answered publicly. The question that nobody has pressed her on, perhaps out of kindness, perhaps out of the limits of what journalists are willing to ask a woman at a press conference about the murder of her mother. When she heard the name Janie Perkins announced in a police press conference, a name she has carried privately for years, was she surprised? Or had she known, somewhere underneath the uncertainty, somewhere in the part of herself that never stopped working on this, that it was always going to be that name? The cameras were rolling. Her face told a story. Nobody asked her directly. There is a filing cabinet in every police department in America. Probably more than one. In these cabinets, in folders thick with faded paper and stapled documents and photographs that were difficult to take and are difficult to look at, there are names. There are mothers and daughters and husbands and strangers who were, on some specific unremarkable night, in the wrong place or the wrong relationship or simply the wrong person for someone who had decided that violence was an answer. The files exist because investigators tried. Because someone did the work of documentation. The interviews, the photographs, the evidence logs, the sworn statements. The files exist because the system at least got that far. But files and justice are different things. And between the moment a file is created and the moment a case is closed, there can be, as Cynthia Gonzalez's family knows better than most, 34 years of waiting. Detective Stafford has not spoken extensively to the press about his process. He is not a man who appears to be interested in his own narrative. What he has said, in the brief public statements attributed to him, is consistent with the picture of an investigator who understood that the Gonzalez case needed to be seen freshly. Not re-investigated from scratch, the original detective had done the foundational work. But seen freshly. Given to people with no prior attachment to the case, no investment in prior conclusions, no sunk cost resistance to a new interpretation of familiar material. The morning he told the students about the arrest, he walked into their classroom and looked at the faces of the young people who had spent a semester with Cynthia Gonzalez's file and said, plainly, the arrest warrant has been written. The marshals are outside her house right now. And then he watched the room come apart with relief and tears and the complicated joy of people who did not expect to matter as much as they turned out to matter. He will not be defined by this case alone. He has others. The same class of students is already reviewing 2 more cold cases from the Arlington PD files. The program that produced the Gonzalez arrest is ongoing. Stafford is not done. But for now, he has given a 40-year-old woman the thing she has been waiting for since she was 6 years old. What does the Gonzalez case tell us about cold cases broadly? It tells us several things, and none of them are comfortable. It tells us that the gap between solving a case and closing it is often not a gap in evidence. The Gonzalez case had witnesses. It had behavioral evidence. It had a suspect who failed 2 polygraphs, could not provide an alibi, and allegedly told 2 separate people specific details about a murder that no uninvolved person should have known. It had all of this in 1991. The gap was not in the evidence. The gap was in the resources, a department without a dedicated cold case unit, a homicide division stretched thin across active investigations, a prosecutorial standard that required forensic certainty that 1991 technology could not always provide for crimes committed in private. It tells us that the people who are most often failed by these gaps are people whose lives the system has historically found easy to discount. Cynthia Gonzalez was a 25-year-old Latina woman who worked as an adult entertainer. She was a good friend and a devoted mother and a person who made every room she entered feel more alive. She was also, in the specific calculus of 1991 American law enforcement, not the kind of victim whose case got the resources and the urgency that it deserved. This is not speculation. It is pattern. It is the documented history of whose cases get solved and whose cases go cold, examined across decades of data by criminologists, advocates, and journalists. The Gonzalez case is one data point in a much larger picture. It tells us that witnesses matter. The 2 men who came forward in 1991 and told investigators what they had heard, who were believed, whose statements were recorded carefully and preserved in a file for 34 years, mattered enormously. Without those sworn statements, Detective Stafford has nothing to build a warrant on. Without those witnesses, the fresh eyes of the UTA students find a different kind of dead end. The witnesses told the truth in 1991. The system preserved what they said. And 34 years later, what they said became the foundation of a capital murder charge. The UTA students who worked the Gonzalez case are finishing their semester. The case that consumed months of their attention is now in the hands of prosecutors, defense attorneys, courts. The class is already at work on 2 new files. 2 more names in 2 more folders. 2 more families who have been waiting for years, or decades, for someone to sit down with the accumulated documentation of the worst thing that ever happened to them and ask the question that hasn't been asked yet. J.C. Concanon has said that she and her classmates had to go through 400 to 500 files and crime scene photographs. She said it matter-of-factly, in the way of someone reporting what the work required. What she didn't say, what the reporters didn't push on, is what it costs a 21-year-old to spend a semester with crime scene photographs of a murdered woman. What it costs to sit in a fluorescent classroom and absorb the forensic documentation of a violent death, and then go home and eat dinner and sleep and come back the next morning and keep reading. The students chose to do this. They were not required to. They could have enrolled in a different advanced seminar. They chose this one, and they chose to take it seriously, and 34 years of waiting ended because they did. Janie Perkins is out on bond as of this writing. Her attorneys say she is innocent. They say the facts will exonerate her. The trial has not begun. The forensic testing that investigators have indicated is underway has not produced publicly reported results. The full evidentiary picture, what the prosecution has, what the defense will challenge, what a jury will ultimately weigh, is not yet visible. What is visible is this: a 63-year-old woman has been charged with capital murder for something that allegedly happened 34 years ago. The witnesses whose statements form a central part of the case are no longer young. Memories shift. Legal proceedings take time. The gap between an arrest and a conviction, in a case this old, built this way, is real and significant. Jessica Roberts is aware of all of this. She is not naive about the road ahead. She has spent 34 years navigating the distance between what she believed and what the law could prove, and she understands that an arrest is not a verdict. She has said she is still processing, that the grief never fully subsided, that it came in waves. But she has also said, "I thought the day would never come." And it did. On County Road 313 in Johnson County, Texas, the land looks the same as it did in 1991. Flat. Dry. The sky enormous overhead. The kind of landscape that absorbs events and gives nothing back. No monument, no marker, nothing to indicate that on a September night 34 years ago, a 25-year-old mother was left there in the dark and found 5 days later in the September heat by people who did not know her name. Cynthia Gonzalez deserved better than this field. She deserved better than 34 years of her daughter waiting for her story to have an ending. She deserved the resources and the urgency and the institutional commitment that would have brought this to resolution in 1992, not 2025. She deserved a world in which a woman's profession doesn't affect how seriously her murder is investigated. She deserved to come home to her 6-year-old daughter. None of that can be given back. That is the permanent arithmetic of violent crime, the debt that can never be repaid, only partially acknowledged. But here, at the end of this story, sitting with the weight of everything this case contains, is the thing that remains true and worth saying plainly: Cynthia Gonzalez was not forgotten. Not by Jessica. Not by the people who loved her. Not by the original detective who worked her case until he died. Not by Detective Stafford, who picked up the file in 2024 and treated it like what it was: the unsolved murder of a real woman who deserved an answer. And not by the 21-year-old students who sat down with 450 pages of a dead woman's case file and decided, for reasons rooted entirely in human decency, that they were going to care. That is not enough. It is never enough. But it is what happened. And it matters. If this case stayed with you, hit subscribe, because every week we go back to the cases that refuse to stay cold. Leave a comment below. What detail from this case do you think investigators should have caught sooner? I read every single one.